Pomponius Stylus, chapter 2. All other creatures looked down toward the earth, but man was given a face so that he might turn his eyes toward the stars and his gaze upon the sky. The poet Ovid. AD 19 summer, emperor ruling, Tiberius. The animal collectors. The days of summer at Villa Julian refreshed and stirred the fertile mind of Pomponia. Sounds became more distinct, smells more delicious, and her stylus flew across her scrolls. They were her constant companions. She laughed out loud and sometimes quietly to herself. She drew simple sketches of life below stairs. As she walked nonchalantly around, secretly watching, observing scenes of domestic life she hadn't experienced before, she watched the cook beating the dog, retreating with a large shoulder of mutton, the basket of fruit tumbling all over the dusty floor as the young scrawny boys scrabbled to grab, fight and hide the fallen morsels in their ragged garments. Each merchant coming to the door bringing produce had gossip and rowdy tales to tell. Pomponia was a silent observer and recorder of these stories. She was up early to listen to their ribald and raucous accounts of life. Words she had no idea the meaning of flowed from the coarse mouths of the traders, so alien to the sheltered, childlike existence she was used to. This summer was a new education for Pomponia. At last, a freedom of convention and expression took over her writing. Here was the language of the common people, sometimes real, ugly, harsh, and undisciplined. They scavenged, they shouted, pushed and shoved each other. She witnessed scenes of anger and screeching for morsels, and then tender moments of unselfishness. She saw care of the injured or disadvantaged fellow slave, and mercy among those who had nothing but themselves to give. Slowly, without realizing it, she was changing. She grew physically over the next few months, but more than just changing from child to young woman, she allowed her mind to develop, grow and alter. She noticed people. She listened not just to words, but observed feelings, pain unspoken, fear and anguish suppressed, and always such sad injustices. Pomponia's world expanded. She grew and no longer fitted ever again into the cramped, cushioned nest of childhood. It was as if an unfurling of her wings took place. She could never return to her childhood-like innocence because she was no longer suited to its confines. Along with this growth, the strength of mind and resilience started to coat her spirit. She quickly grasped facts and situations, and without being overly disturbed, was able to assimilate in her writings a course of action that would protect her, but also enable her to really enjoy her life and make significant plans. Many merchants frequented daily the kitchens of Villa Julian. Also, there were travellers to the adjacent farm that supplied a great deal of the food for the family and slaves. These people fascinated Pomponia, and she found great pleasure in watching from a hidden position among the long dry grasses. One morning, as Pomponia and Hannah were sitting alongside the tracks leading to the home farm, enjoying early succulent cherries, they saw great swathes of dust clouds in the distance. The sun was still not high in the sky, but the heat shimmered over the distant plains. The haze dust appeared to be moving nearer. Pomponia stayed low among the bushes and lifted her head to shield her eyes from the piercing sunlight. From amongst the blurred cloud, she saw carts drawn by oxen with crates covered in sacking rumbling along. There were turbaned men dressed with leather and flowing robes, their faces heavily lined and darkened by the wind and sun. These rode on sturdy horses, jangling their ornamented harnesses. Black Nubian slaves followed on foot, leading a procession of 3 large elephants. Behind this group were men herding along flocks of sheep and goats. While still at a short distance, the troop slowed down to a standstill. There were 5 men riding on horses. 2 of them swung themselves swiftly down. They were heavily robed in thick, richly coloured garments. The taller of the two shouted with raised arms, addressing the other smaller but very corpulent man. The taller man pushed hard the shoulders of the stout man, whilst the other three now rushed forward to restrain them. Pomponia could not hear the words, but could see by their fervent actions anger was rising. There was a sharp, crisp, metallic sound which echoed across to her ears as the two angry men drew out their curved, glistening swords. Pomponia watched transfixed. Never had she seen literal sword-to-sword combat before. The sun caught the edges of their weapons as they clashed together. Although the shorter man appeared to struggle, he lunged and dived, shouting curses at the taller opponent. Then suddenly, the tall man stumbled. In his rage, the other darted forwards and from beneath his garments drew a short, razor-sharp dagger. As he thrust it forward towards the stomach of the other, he too misjudged the ground and stumbled as he lurched and ripped the garments of the other's sleeve, carving a scarlet wound into the skin. As they faltered to regain their balance, the three unarmed men darted forward and dragged the fighting men apart. They appeared to be quieting the situation. Ragged slaves rushed forward to attend to the wounded man. He cursed and shouted abuse at everyone around him, jabbing at the air and pointing towards one of the carts that appeared to be lopsided. Suddenly, an unearthly groaning roar cut through the air, quickly followed by hissing and growling sounds. Pomponia was startled and raised herself up from her sitting position to a semi-crouch, why she could part the grasses to get a better view of what all this commotion was about. The slaves that had been driving the carts were removing the coverings of the crates, and there beneath was the most fascinating display of wild animals Pomponia had ever seen. Prowling up and down the first crate was a huge male lion. The slave attending held within his hands a squirming small goat. He drew his dagger and slit the throat of the goat. Blood gushed forth onto the ground. The lion swayed to and fro, threatening the crate to capsize. A loud shouted command immediately caused the slave to slice through the head of the dead goat, and quickly he pushed the carcass through a grill, and whilst the lion pounced on the flesh, he then deftly slid a large wooden pitcher, spilling over with water through an opening at the side. Pomponia stared on, transfixed by scenes she'd never seen before. She'd only looked at drawings of such beasts and heard from her tutors stories told to her and her brothers of the ferocity and size of these wild animals. The second cart revealed a cage with a black, sleek, large cat who was hissing and weaving its tail angrily around. It kept rolling on its side and groaning. A young Nubian boy was speaking through the cage, and his voice seemed to settle the large cat, which allowed him to place his hands upon the cat's head. The cat was clearly in distress, but the boy never left the side of the cage and poured water onto a cloth, then doused the tongue of the cat, repeatedly squeezing water into the cat's mouth. The third cart was surrounded by slaves who were all throwing their arms in the air and shouting loudly. One of the leaders of the horsemen came over and issued instructions. It appeared this was the cart that was lopsided. It had lost one of its wheels, and the cage was in great danger of capsizing and crashing onto the ground. They kept the cage covered, whilst the scrawny slaves all put their bodies beneath the broken side. More people were called over, and a large piece of timber was wedged under the cart. The director of the slaves then called for them to leverage with a large stone for the cart to be put back upright. As it was slowly raised, the cage slipped, and a rough growling sound rumbled from the covered cage. The nearest man leapt up in alarm and cowered beneath the cart. It wobbled and creaked. The director took out a long leather whip and lashed at the slaves. They fell against each other, wailing and raising their arms and voices to their gods above. The leaders now mustered more men together, bodies and arms strained against the weight of the cart and its cage. Ragged, scarred, and scared, they heaved together as the cart was righted. They all collapsed over into the dust, then ran and scuttled away towards their flocks they'd been with. The thick sacking that had been over this cage was removed, and standing tall inside was a huge brown bear. He let out a deafening bellow as he raised his head high to reveal a set of sharp, long teeth. His keeper came forward and threw a bucket full of large vegetables, grasses, and a dead bird to him. The noises these hungry animals now made was just that of eating and devouring their food. Further sights caught Pomponia's attention. Strange-looking birds that she'd never seen before made a low hissing sound. They plumped up their necks and chirped. She thought similarly to the turkeys she'd seen on the farm. These birds were much bigger, long-legged, long-necked, with ungainly rotund bodies and feathers that draped around their body. The language of these travellers Pomponia recognised as the Koine Greek spoken as the common language of most ordinary people within the empire. She could make out that they were discussing the need for food and water. By this time, all the noise and loud shouting had caused the keeper of the home farm to venture out along with his workers to see what was happening. Pomponia and Hannah laid very low and still, but listened carefully. The travellers were requesting food and water, along with help in repairing the iron wheel of the broken cart. It was a known fact that the household of Gaius welcomed strangers, so the keeper of the home farm, Dupor, duly showed hospitality to the travellers. They were shown where to draw water, and as soon as the travellers produced some of their rich cloths and pouches of gold were opened, Dupor could see this would be a mutually advantageous relationship that would gain his master's favour. There were even makeshift stalls made available for the wild animals, and the strange-looking birds were corralled into a wooden fenced area. The whole farm was abuzz with excitement. Pomponia and Hannah had been watching and listening now for well over 3 hours, and knew they had to return to the villa very shortly. There was so much to talk about, so much to see. Pomponia was bursting with questions and curiosity about the mixture of travellers and strange wild animals. As she was leaving her vantage point, she glanced back for the last time to see the black cat's cage being carried to a shady spot to one side of the farm's wall. The young boy was still alongside, and he never stopped his patient vigil with the water. Pomponia longed to inquire what his name was, why he was there, and what the cause of the big cat's distress was. However, it was already way past the time they had to eat with the family. Both Hannah and Pomponia would return later on in the day, maybe along with her father, so they could investigate the most interesting group of people and strange animals. When Pomponia and Hannah arrived back at Villa Julian, there was already an excited air about the place. Slaves were being summoned busily to fetch and carry food and provisions. Gaius and Assinia were speaking together in the entrance hall as Pomponia walked in. Her mother rushed over to her. "Oh, there you are, my dear. I have not seen you this morning. We were beginning to wonder where you were. Oh, I see you have Hannah accompanying you, so all is well. Such excitement this very morning. We have a large company of travellers at the home farm. There is so much gossip scurrying around among the slaves. We have to go for ourselves to establish the true situation and make the acquaintance of the leaders. From what Felix has told us, there are 5 richly clad, illustrious noblemen from the Orient who are hunters and collectors of exotic animals for the games at the Circus Maximus. Your father intends for us to see this spectacle together. But where have you been, Pomponia? You look very out of sorts. Your colour is raised and your garments are dusty, and your hair is full of, well, I'm not sure, is it grass and dust?" Pomponia was very aware of her disarray. She looked up at her mother and father eagerly. "Oh, so we can all go to meet the travellers. I could hear the animals and their strange noises. We were looking on from a distance, hidden behind the shrubs and grasses. Such sights I have never seen before. There were huge bird-like creatures with long legs and necks. They did not appear to have wings that would be able to lift their great body up into the sky. They made gurgling noises, very similar to the turkeys. There was a large black cat in its crate, hissing and groaning, its tail flicking and twitching. We also saw a tall brown bear, and a lion was also amongst the animals and elephants. I have never seen anything like this. The pictures I have been shown did not prepare me for the magnificence of these wild animals. And following along were many sheep and goats herded together. I fear their purpose is just to feed the wild beasts. So many slaves there were, but ragged and brown-skinned, unlike the men on horseback, who were heavily armed and draped in rich garments. Oh, I'll go quickly and change and be ready to accompany you and father. I do not want to miss this for anything. That late afternoon, the family, along with a jostling crowd of slaves, all wanting to see for themselves if the stories they'd been told were true, followed Gaius to the farm. Some imagined giants of men on flying horses, beasts and howling dragons, uttering earth-shaking growls. These stories had been quickly passed around and greatly exaggerated. In fact, as they got closer to the camp, quite a few of the slaves fled as they heard a loud roar from the crate of the lion. Pomponia stayed nervously behind her mother and father. Her father beckoned Pomponia closer as he pointed to the large, long-necked birds. The large bird-like creatures you spoke of, Pomponia, they are ostriches. What handsome plumage they have. Come, let us investigate together this gaggle of visitors. What stories they may have to tell us. 3 men, richly dressed and heavily armed with swords, leather breastplates, swaggered across to Gaius. Good day, our most excellent hosts. I am Caelius. This is my fellow collector, Pastiscus and Xerxes. All 3 men swept a low, deep bow before Gaius. Their cloaks and clothing were richly embroidered in threads of gold and deep colours of blue and purple. In contrast with the richness of their clothing, their skin was swarthy and deeply etched with lines from wind and weather. Although Pomponia was used to being in the presence of nobility, these men made her uneasy. She lowered her gaze, noticing their dusty sandals. The spokesman for the 3 had long, curling, cracked nails on his toes. Raising her eye, she saw his left cheekbone and a natural livid deep crease from eyebrow to jawline. As he caught her eye, his mouth opened to a wide, leering smile as the sun caught the gold of his upper teeth. Pomponia shivered. She drew closer behind her father and listened as they recounted to him their great travels throughout the empire. They had traversed the deserts in Syria, Africa, and Asia Minor. The large black cat, the panther, had been caught in Greece at the cost of 2 slaves' lives. Caelius gestured toward the crate where the big cat still groaned. She is labouring. Her keeper Kofi must keep her alive on pain of his life. Her value is worth 10 slaves' pitiful lives. She will give birth soon. We ask that our caravan of animals and us who are under the direction of our most illustrious Caesar may remain on your land for some days. Our carts are in need of repair. We only trouble you for water, fresh produce, and the use of tools and wood. You will be handsomely repaid. Caelius bellowed orders to slaves who were hovering nearby, preparing wood to make a fire. They quickly brought a heavy casket toward them all, which they opened, revealing a significant amount of gold and silver coins, along with the leather-bound pouches and many scrolls. He reached inside and, taking a pouch, lifted it toward Gaius. This will be down payment on our expenses you may incur from our stay here. He raised his empty hand and cuffed the nearest slave, who had appeared to lean over the casket. On pain of death, you filthy curs, will be any that dares to take from the coffers. The man limped away, holding his bruised head. Caelius' much beringed finger had dealt a hefty blow. Now, my good sir, my fellows here, Pastiscus and Xerxes, would be most happy to show you some of our collections. The other 2 of our comrades, Tullius and Marcus, they are somewhat resting presently. Having become skilled in training our caged birds and monkeys to perform tricks, we would be most honoured for you to join us this evening for a night of feasting and displays. The slaves of Greece play the lyre and are able to perform great shows of their strength. As this scar-faced, cruel man finished speaking, he bowed low before Gaius, clapped his hands and swept away towards his now erected great tent, while his cowering slaves swiftly followed behind him. Pastichus and Xerxes were of a similar build as Caelius, but neither of them carried any weapons that were visible. Pastichus was very dark in appearance, but his eyes were of the palest blue, mesmerizing but cold. His right hand fingers were covered with jewelled rings, gold with emeralds and amethysts, and around his neck hung a coiled golden necklace. As Pomponia looked more closely, she saw that it was in the shape of a snake, and its eyes were jewels of amber. His companion Xerxes carried a leather pouch around his waist. His head was swathed with a linen turban, making it mysteriously difficult to judge what he really looked like. But his voice was softer and carried the tones of a more genteel Roman citizen. When he addressed the family, he spoke in their native Latin of the gentry. Gaius was drawn toward this fellow and soon learned that he had lived in Gaul before being taken to Rome and becoming a Roman citizen, learning great skills in the hunting and capture of wild animals for the Circus Maximus. He now had personal estates just outside Rome and trained and housed many animals before they were transported to the games. He appeared a fair man who seemed to care for the welfare of the animals. Whether this was out of general altruism or for self-preservation and the furthering of his wealth, Pomponia was not sure. She quietly waited for an opportunity to see more of this group and made up her mind to visit the crate of the panther and the young boy Kofi. Hannah stuck very closely by her side as they passed very close to the panther's crate. Iron bars had been positioned across the front, and Kofi was passing his hand over the back of the large cat. As he did so, he hummed a low droning sound which appeared to settle the animal's pains. The girls waited silently, watching the scene. Young boy and wild, pained animal. It was a very touching scene, the soft low tones soporific and lulling. As they watched, the boy did not turn, but said in a quiet voice, "You have come to see the plight of this cat, mistress. Do not make a sudden or loud movement. She is about to give birth during the next few hours. Her pains will then cease. If you are not frightened, come forward, and I will tell you her story." Pomponia and Hannah moved quietly towards the crouching boy. He held his dark, shining head high on broad shoulders. His right arm was outstretched toward the cage, and his simple linen tunic covered his tall, thin body. The boy continued to hum as the big cat drowsily lay on its side. "What is your name? Where are you from?" Pomponia asked. "I am Kofi, the son of King of Aksumite, Zahakel, Aksum in Ethiopia. I was taken as a child when the hunters came for our elephants, ivory, and wild animals." He said these words without feeling or resentment. As he paused, Pomponia noticed tears welling up in his eyes. This boy could only have been 10 or 11 years of age. She wondered what horrors he'd experienced in his short, displaced life. Hannah touched Pomponia's hand and signalled as if she wished to speak. Pomponia drew back and nodded her head towards her. "Young man, I am Hannah, slave to my mistress here, Pomponia Graecina. I too have come from a foreign land, taken as a young girl, from humble background, but please know that we mean you no harm, and this family that owns all this land and property is kindly disposed toward its slaves. How can we help you?" The boy drew his left hand across his tear-stained face, and raising his eyes to Hannah said, "My life is of little worth, but this animal I want to help. When her cubs are born, they will be taken away from her. Then she will be transported to Rome. The cubs will be killed. If there is some way that we can preserve them, I know that there will be 2 born to her tonight. Can you help me? I will need a skin bottle of sheep's milk to feed them. My duties will be to make sure that the mother survives. I need help with the cubs." Pomponia could see in his eyes a pleading for their help. She asked him what future the panther had in Rome. He smiled to them and, shaking his head, said he had a plan to escape with the panther when she was rested and take care of her, even if it meant letting her loose into the wild again. She was a queen and he was a prince. They could not be enslaved without a fight for their kingdoms. He told them he'd learned to read directions by following the constellations and the stars. He would find his way to his homeland. They talked together quietly for some time. Pomponia and Hannah decided they would speak to the farm manager's son, Fabius. He was quick-witted and well known for being able to acquire goods from places that nobody dared to ask where they came from. He knew of secret hideaways where things would be hidden and was very clever at making things disappear. They would leave Kofi and return with Fabius. It took some time before they were able to find Fabius. He'd gone fishing earlier in the day and was now sleeping high in one of the lofts. When he knew it was Hannah and Mistress Pomponia that were looking for him, being apprehensive but very curious, he pretended he'd not been well, feigning a sore stomach, gripping it with a pained look on his face. His eyes, though, did not betray to Pomponia. He was full of mischief, and when he heard of the account of the panther, the cubs, and the need for help in their dilemma, he immediately forgot his stomach and was upright and ready for action. Fabius loved adventure, and the riskier the scheme, the more appealing it became to him. He dreamed of one day being a gladiator or a great charioteer managing high-speed stallions in the arena. For now, though, the rescue and survival of cubs, and possibly the danger of concealing a runaway slave and wild black panther, filled his imagination and fueled his actions. He told them of a cave some distance in the hills with a stream nearby that had an entrance covered by an ancient ivy. It would be the perfect location for the cubs to be kept safe. He would be able to get the wineskins and milk from the ewes. He had numerous siblings who would not be missed in an overcrowded home. They would be more than happy to help with the feeding. Hannah told Pomponia they must have nothing more to do with this event. For the safety of the slave Kofi, the panther, and the cubs, and themselves, they must leave everything to Fabius. Pomponia was not at all sure that she could do this, but Hannah was very firm with Pomponia. They must go about their lives at Villa Julian and not get involved in whatever happened next to the slave and his panther. Pomponia finally promised she would do her very best to keep all of this a secret, only writing her accounts in her private scrolls. However, Pomponia knew there would be some expense incurred for the upkeep of the cubs. Also, in order to make sure that Fabius would maintain his secrecy of their plans, she gave him a small pouch of gold coins, along with 4 of the emeralds that were on one of her necklaces. He eagerly took them from her. Fabius felt his fortunes were about to change. He had adventure before him and a pouch filled with more gold than he had ever seen in his lifetime. This, along with something he now knew was more valuable than money, knowledge of secrets. That night, when darkness fell, the campfires were lit, the wood sparked hot shavings into the air. Musicians played the lyre, and pipe music of an oriental strain filled the air. The 2 men Pomponia had seen fighting opened the entertainment. The taller of the 2 had his arm wrapped in white cloth, but all animosity between them seemed to have disappeared. They lifted large flagons of wine up to the gods and loudly announced the beginning of the feasting and games. The Gracinus family sat and watched on as the Nubian slaves performed jumps and lifts. Flames were thrown across the heads of men who danced and spun around. Drums rolled. Loud calls in foreign tongues shrieked and laughed. The monkeys cackled and danced dressed up as emperors and royalty, with tight gold chains around their necks, pulling and urging them into twists and cartwheels, headstands and handstands. their skirts and turbans twirling and bobbing around. Exotic birds were paraded about, speaking in strange tongues along with ribald words that only Gaius and the common slaves had heard before. Loud guffaws of intoxicated laughter echoed through that night air. The family, along with their slaves and farm workers, all watched on, with many calls for more, more. A frenzied intensity of excitement and noise filled the valley that night. These distant sounds meanwhile muffled the whines from the Black Panther, as Kofi saw the birth of 2 small cubs. He knew the danger had only just begun for his panther, himself, and the cubs. Fabius was on hand all of the time and had arranged for the cubs to be taken away to the cave by the first light of day. The panther suckled her cubs that night, little knowing the greater pain than of giving birth was about to take place for her. Towards dawn, Kofi and Fabius gathered together the skin and furs of a sheep and rolled them into 2 tight balls. They placed them close to the sleeping panther and carefully picked up the 2 cubs. Kofi stayed on watch for the rest of the night next to his panther. She hardly stirred. Whilst Fabius took the cubs tucked up tightly against his chest, high up the pathway to the hidden cave. That very day he'd found a large female dog, of various mixtures of breeding, whose pups had been killed by a snake. His brother was waiting with the dog in the cave, and after a few minutes of sniffing and cajoling, the cubs had latched onto the bitch and were suckling well. Fabius kept watch. He needed very little sleep. His keen sense of hearing was alert, his body tingled with excitement. He thought of many things and made plans. This rearing of not just 1, but 2 valuable large cats could be a way of his gaining favour and profit for his future. His eyes glistened, lips moistened as he rubbed his hands together. Yes, he muttered to himself. His fortunes were about to change. He had all of that long night to set his plans in motion. A single owl flew across that dawn sky. After the night's loud and eventful happenings, the stillness of morning was broken by its eerie hoot and soft padding of its deep feathered wings against a balmy quietness.